They thought I was just another store owner, another small business they could push around with warnings, threats, and finally, vandalism. They had no idea the man they were harassing owned the entire commercial complex they operated in. The storefront they spray painted? That was the bait. And they walked right into it. It started with a sticker, a fluorescent yellow circle slapped on my window that read, "Non-compliant storefront, action required." At first I thought it was a joke. My business was spotless, floor to ceiling, glass windows, clean signage, neutral branding. We weren't flashy, we were precise. But I quickly realized this was no prank. It came from the HOA that oversaw the mall property, and they weren't playing. You see, most people don't know that malls, especially strip malls and mixed commercial centers, often have their own little HOAs, committees made up of concerned tenants or property reps who think they're real estate royalty. In this case, the HOA wasn't even elected. It was self-appointed. 3 board members, 1 clipboard, and a mountain of entitlement. They'd been harassing tenants for months, complaining about window decals, indoor displays, even the smell of some restaurants. But nobody pushed back. Small business owners tend to just survive and keep moving. I watched them pick off shop after shop with random fines and warning letters. No one had time to fight. Most just paid and hoped to stay under the radar. Then they got to me. At first, it was subtle. A letter about non-uniform signage, then a complaint about the shade of paint on my doorframe, literally 1 hex code off from the mall standard. I adjusted everything just to avoid trouble, but then came the window sticker, bold, loud, public. It made it look like my shop had failed an inspection or worse, was unsafe. That crossed the line. I walked straight to the HOA office, which was ironically inside the same mall complex. It was a rented office suite labeled Community Oversight, decorated with fake plants and passive-aggressive posters about cleanliness. I asked to speak to the board. The woman at the front desk barely looked up. "You'll need to submit a request in writing," she said. "We don't do unscheduled drop-ins." I looked her in the eyes and said, "You do today." She blinked. But before she could speak, a voice from inside said, "Let him in." It was Darren, one of the board members, mid-50s, slicked back hair, tan like a used car salesman who never left the lot. He smiled like he was doing me a favor. "We've had complaints," he said. "Your storefront doesn't reflect the visual identity we're trying to establish." I asked for specifics. He offered none, just more buzzwords. Cohesion, visual harmony, standardization. I asked him one simple question. "Did you talk to the property owner before issuing the sticker?" He smirked. "You mean the leasing office? They trust our judgment." I smiled back. "No, I mean the owner." He scoffed. "Why? You planning to file a complaint?" And that's when I leaned in and said, "Not exactly. I am the owner." The look on Darren's face was priceless. That smug confidence evaporated in less than a second. He blinked twice, tried to laugh, then cleared his throat like he'd misheard me. "Excuse me?" he said, voice a bit thinner now. I repeated, slower this time. "I own the entire property, every storefront, every square foot of this mall. Technically, I own it through a holding company. Purchased it quietly 2 years ago when the previous management ran into financial trouble. It was a silent deal, on purpose. I didn't want tenants or even the board to treat me differently. I wanted to run my shop like anyone else, understand their needs, see what actually worked, and apparently witness the HOA implode from the inside." I pulled out a copy of the deed and leasing structure, showed him the name of the holding company, then pointed to the LLC registered under mine. His eyes scanned the page, then darted back to me. "This doesn't change protocol," he muttered. "We still manage compliance for the space." I shook my head. "You don't manage anything. You were tolerated. That changes today." I left the office without another word. Behind me, the silence was deafening. I knew what would happen next. They'd scramble, call the leasing office, call the old manager, dig through emails trying to find a loophole, but there wasn't one. I had made sure of it the day I signed the ownership papers. The HOA's role existed only because the previous owner never challenged it. I was not that owner. By the time I got back to my store, the sticker was already gone, peeled off quietly, no apology, no explanation, just vanished, as if nothing had happened. But it was too late for subtle fixes. The damage had been done, not to my storefront, but to their credibility. And I wasn't about to let that go. The next day, I called an emergency meeting. This time, it wasn't in the HOA office. It was in the mall's public courtyard. I posted signs, sent emails to every tenant, community discussion, property updates, and rights overview. At first, people were hesitant. Most assumed it was just another HOA stunt. But when they saw me standing at the front, not as a business owner, but as the landlord, they stopped and listened. I told them everything: who I was, why I'd kept it quiet, what the board had been doing, how many of their fines had zero legal standing. I showed them proof, photos of overstepped boundaries, inflated citations, unapproved fee collections. Faces in the crowd shifted from disbelief to anger to a strange mix of relief and revenge. One shop owner, Maria, who ran a bakery 2 doors down, spoke up. They made me repaint my windows twice in 1 year. Said my frosting displays were visual pollution. Another tenant mentioned threats of eviction for displaying pride flags. The more they spoke, the clearer it became. This wasn't just bad management. This was abuse dressed up as policy. I ended the meeting with one sentence. They thought they were untouchable. Now they answered to me. And from that moment on, the balance of power had officially flipped. I didn't waste time. The very next morning, I drafted a formal notice terminating the HOA's administrative role within the mall property. No dramatic speeches, no warnings, just a signed letter backed by property law and 3 ironclad clauses in the original lease agreement. As the legal owner, I had full discretion over all auxiliary management. The HOA's authority was not a right, it was a privilege, and they had abused it. The notice was delivered to their office by certified courier. I could have handed it to them myself, but I wanted the message to be clear. This wasn't personal, it was business. They had operated like tyrants in a kingdom they didn't own. Now, the king had arrived, and he wasn't asking for permission. Of course, they didn't go quietly. That afternoon, Darren sent a reply through a lawyer. It was a weak attempt to stall, something about protecting established community values and upholding continuity. I passed it straight to my legal team, who responded with a 2-page breakdown of every legal misstep the board had made, from unauthorized citations to fraudulent fine collection. And as a bonus, we attached statements from 5 tenants willing to testify. One by one, board members started disappearing. First Darren, then Lisa, the compliance officer who treated minor signage like federal violations. The last to fold was Gerald, who used to walk around filming people's windows for evidence. I'll never forget watching him remove the HOA advisory placard from their office door. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted, like someone who'd finally realized the castle he ruled was made of sand. But I wasn't done. I called a meeting with all tenants. No suits, no legalese, just face-to-face, eye-level conversation. I told them things were changing. No more arbitrary rules, no more surprise inspections. Every store could personalize their branding, within reason. They could decorate for holidays, use their windows to express their identity, not just their inventory. You could feel the atmosphere shift, like a giant weight had been lifted off the plaza. A florist cried. Not because she was emotional, but because she finally felt safe putting her own name on the window. For years, she'd been operating under a generic banner because the HOA didn't like her font. A bookstore owner brought in a chalkboard. sign with a cheeky joke written on it. "Let's see if someone rips this one down," he said with a grin. They were testing the waters, reclaiming space. I also made it clear that we would be forming a new tenant council, not to enforce, but to collaborate. Open meetings, rotating leadership, real representation. The goal wasn't control, it was shared vision. If something needed fixing, we'd fix it together. If one business succeeded, we all did. The building began to change, subtly at first. Colors brightened, signs became unique, music drifted out from a few open doors. The place had energy again, not forced, but real. And as I walked through this plaza, one evening, watching people linger a little longer in front of shop windows, I realized something. This wasn't just about kicking out a toxic board. It was about giving life back to a place they tried to sterilize. I hadn't planned on going public. My goal was to fix the ecosystem within the mall, not make headlines. But truth spreads fast, especially when it tastes like justice. And what started as whispers between shop owners quickly became a story that couldn't be contained. One day I was having coffee with a local bakery owner, and the next my phone was lighting up with interview requests. Local news, a small-town podcast, and then regional media. Apparently, kicking out a corrupt HOA while owning the entire mall makes for a compelling headline. I agreed to one interview, just one. A quiet sit-down with a reporter who respected the tenants and wanted to understand what really happened. I kept my tone steady. "This wasn't about revenge," I said. "This was about restoring balance. Business owners deserve to thrive, not survive under the weight of rules written by people who don't risk anything." That quote took off like wildfire. Within 24 hours, it was clipped, reposted, and quoted on forums and TikTok. Even a business coach with a massive following stitched it into a video titled, "How to Take Back Power Without Saying a Word." But the story wasn't just about me. The shop owners were finding their voices too. A florist posted side by side photos of her storefront, one from before when it was stripped of color by HOA mandate, and one from now, filled with flowers, paintings, and hanging lights. The caption said, "They told me flowers were a distraction. Now customers say it. Feels like home." Another shop owner printed a blown-up copy of his last fine and hung it on the wall under a plaque that read, "Retired Tyranny." And then came the symbol. It started with one store, Maria's Bakery. She took the old yellow non-compliant sticker the HOA had placed on her window, scanned it, and redesigned it into a badge of defiance. Same shape, same bold font. But this time it read, "Independent and Proud." Bright yellow, centered in the window, defiant and proud. Within days, half the stores on the strip had one. Customers started asking about it. "What's this mean?" And when they were told, they stayed longer, bought more, told their friends, foot traffic spiked, Google reviews went up, and the mall, once quiet, sterile, almost robotic, became loud with identity, and people loved it. From there, it went viral. A neighborhood in another city copied the sticker idea and sent me a thank you email. We had no idea we could say no, they wrote. One guy from out of state asked if he could use my legal framework to challenge his own commercial HOA. I said yes, and then created a downloadable guide. Just like that, what started as me defending my own store became a public playbook for standing up to abuse disguised as order. The media caught on fast. Headlines like "Landlord Kicks Out His Own HOA" and "The Mall That Took Its Power Back" began circulating. One article called it "The Stone Plaza Rebellion." Another dubbed me "the silent CEO who blew the whistle on mall tyranny." I laughed at that one. But behind the humor, there was something real. People were finally seeing that these kinds of systems don't have to go unchallenged. Even City Council reached out. They asked if I'd be willing to consult on their small business oversight reform. I declined at first. I wasn't a politician. I was just a guy who liked things to be fair. But they persisted. Eventually, I agreed to sit in. Not to lead, just to advise. Because if my experience could save others the months of quiet suffering these business owners had endured, then maybe this wasn't just a win. It was a beginning. And through it all, the most powerful shift wasn't in the headlines. It was in the people. Tenants who once spoke in whispers now shared openly. New murals were painted. A jazz musician began performing every Friday near the fountain. Even the teenager who used to get yelled at for skateboarding was now invited to do tricks during weekend events. The mall wasn't just alive again, it was ours. And all because a board thought they could control a storefront without knowing who owned the floor beneath their feet. It's funny how quickly something small can grow into something massive when it hits the right nerve. What began as a sticker on my shop window had now become a conversation across the commercial real estate world. Messages started flooding my inbox, not just from tenants, but from landlords, developers, even property attorneys. Some wanted to know how I removed the HOA legally. Others just wanted to know how I had the guts. I started answering everyone I could. At first it was one-on-one, but soon I realized I needed to scale. So I recorded a simple video, me sitting in my office, walking through what happened, what I did, and what I learned. No dramatic music, no editing, just facts. I titled it, "How to Dismantle a Toxic HOA from the Inside." Within 3 days, it had over 250,000 views. The comments were filled with stories eerily similar to mine. People were done being pushed around by organizations that were supposed to protect them. That's when I decided to go further. I built a free online toolkit, not just for commercial tenants, but for anyone facing HOA abuse. Sample bylaws, legal, clause templates, letter formats to challenge citations, even a map of states where HOA overreach is most common. I called it the Power Reset, and the response? Overwhelming. Forums picked it up. Business newsletters featured it. A few real estate podcasts brought me on as a guest. Suddenly, I was no longer just a mall owner. I was that guy who beat the system without breaking it. I'll never forget one message in particular. A single mom who ran a hair salon in another state wrote, "They fined me for putting up a sign that said walk-ins welcome. They said it ruined the neighborhood's image. I used your toolkit. Last week they dropped the fine and apologized." That's when I knew this wasn't just about my situation anymore. It had become a movement, not angry, not chaotic, just organized, legal, and undeniably justified. I wasn't starting fires. I was showing people where the fire extinguishers had always been. Of course, not everyone loved what I was doing. A few HOA loyalists sent some passive-aggressive emails. One accused me of undermining community cohesion. Another called me a dangerous influence encouraging insubordination. I printed that one out and framed it in the break room. I wasn't encouraging chaos. I was restoring balance. There's a big difference between accountability and control. The HOA had forgotten that. I was reminding people. Back at the mall, the transformation continued. A tech startup opened in one of the vacant units, a co-working space where small creators could build, brainstorm, and launch new ventures. They named it The Grid, a nod to systems, but also the people who unplug from the broken ones. It felt symbolic, like the mall wasn't just changing physically, but culturally. We were becoming a case study for what happens when you take the power back peacefully. Even commercial developers began calling. People who had built massive plazas and shopping strips, asking how I structured tenant agreements, how I handled governance without a traditional board. I walked them through it. Transparency, communication, shared leadership. HOA-style rulebooks were replaced by value-based partnerships. It was simpler than people thought. They just had to let go of control, and that's what scared them most. At this point, I wasn't trying to be a disruptor. I was just being honest. The systems people accept for decades are rarely questioned, until someone stands still long enough to ask, why does it have to be this way? And once that question is asked out loud, there's no putting the silence back. This wasn't just a mall anymore. It had become a message, and I wasn't finished delivering it. The funny thing about change is that, when it finally happens, It always feels like it was supposed to be that way all along. The mall looked completely different now, not just visually, but in energy, in rhythm, in presence. And yet, if you weren't paying close attention, you might think it had always been like this. Alive, expressive, collaborative. But I remembered what came before. I remembered the silence, the tight smiles, the fear of color. And I knew we'd broken something that was meant to stay locked forever. There was one final piece left, the old HOA office. It had sat empty for months. After the board collapsed and their reign ended, no one dared to enter it. The door stayed, shut, blinds drawn, as if it still held power in its silence. But to me, it was just another unit. So I did what I should have done long ago. I unlocked it. Inside, it was exactly as I remembered. Cold gray carpet, a table stacked with clipboards, wall posters printed with community standards in bold Helvetica. It felt less like an office and more like a shrine to control. I took a deep breath, then walked to the desk and opened the drawers. Fines, photos, reports, all filed in neat folders, evidence of years of micromanagement disguised as order. I packed it all into boxes. Not out of spite, but for record keeping. Because one day someone would ask how it all used to be, and we'd need to show them. Not just to remember, but to never forget how easy it is to normalize restriction when no one pushes back. We transformed the office into something new. A shared resource center, free Wi-Fi, open seating, a mini library of books on business, creativity, and, ironically, community leadership. The clipboards were replaced with coffee mugs. The sign on the door now read The Collective, a place where decisions were made with people, not over them. Months later, I stood at the front of the plaza during a weekend event. Families wandered between pop-up stands. Live music played in the background. A group of teens laughed while filming a TikTok next to a mural that covered what used to be the dull gray HOA wall. The mall had become more than just a place to shop. It had become a place to belong. A woman I didn't recognize approached me with her son. She introduced herself as a vendor from a nearby city. "We heard about what you did here," she said. "My HOA is trying to control everything, from the color of my awning to what time I close. I used your guide. They backed off." Her son handed me a small sticker. It was yellow, round, and had 3 bold words in the middle. "We choose. Different." I placed it in the window of my store, not as a statement, but as a reminder. Because this wasn't about me. It never was. It was about every person who thought they had no choice. Every voice that stayed silent to avoid another fine. Every tenant who believed they had to play small just to survive. We shattered that illusion. We showed what happens when control is questioned and community is prioritized. And in the end, the most powerful thing I ever owned wasn't the mall. It was the moment I realized I didn't need to control it. Just open the doors and trust the people inside.